Before it became known for a night the world could not forget, Bhopal was simply a city, a place of lakes and marketplaces, winding roads and evening chai. In the early 1980s, it was a city in transition, not quite industrial, not quite rural, hovering in that uncertain space between tradition and growth. Its people lived close to one another. Families slept side by side on concrete floors cooled by the night. Children played under corrugated tin roofs. Mothers lit stoves with dry kindling and watched as smoke curled upward and outward. There was life everywhere, quiet and full. The mornings in Bhopal began early. Vendors pushed carts through the alleys with steel pots clinking together. Loudspeakers crackled with prayer calls. Laundry lines stretched between doorframes. In neighborhoods like Jayaprakash Nagar and Kola, the days moved slowly. The pace of life didn't match the rising concrete towers in other Indian cities. In Bhopal, time was still a little soft at the edges. In the northern part of the city stood a factory. At first glance, it wasn't much to look at. A series of low industrial buildings, steel piping, rust-colored storage tanks, all enclosed behind a high wall. A sign at the entrance read, Union Carbide India Limited. The factory had arrived years earlier in the 1970s. One more mark in India's post-colonial ambition to grow its economy, feed its people, and build local industry. Union Carbide was an American company. Its Bhopal plant was a subsidiary, built to produce pesticides. The main product was called 7, a brand name for carbaryl, a chemical designed to kill insects that threatened crops. In theory, it was a tool to fight hunger, to protect yields, to help farmers. But the process of making 7 wasn't simple. One of its key ingredients was methyl isocyanate, or mic, a colorless, highly volatile chemical. Mic had to be stored carefully. It was sensitive to water, to heat, to contamination. Even small exposure could cause burns, respiratory damage, or death. At Union Carbide's main plant in the U.S., mic was tightly controlled. In Bhopal, the standards were not the same. At the time, few people living near the factory knew exactly what chemicals were inside. The workers knew mic was dangerous. Some had been trained. Others were hired without much background at all. But many local residents didn't understand the risk. They called it the pesticide factory. Some said it made medicine for plants. Others simply called it carbide. The factory bordered tightly populated neighborhoods. Ramayana Nagar, Kazi Camp, Arif Nagar. These were not distant suburbs. These were walls almost touching walls. Many homes were built with brick and sheet metal. Some had no doors. On humid nights, families slept on their rooftops to catch the wind. The Union Carbide plant loomed just beyond their view, close but not close enough to question. And it wasn't always working. By 1984, the factory was struggling. Demand for pesticides had fallen. Costs were being cut. Maintenance was delayed. Pipes aged. Valves stuck. Workers were laid off or reassigned. Some safety systems were taken offline altogether. There were warning signs, but they were quiet, technical, the kind of warnings only a few people knew how to hear. Small leaks had already occurred in the years before. In 1981, a worker was accidentally exposed to mic and died. Other incidents followed: gas clouds, eye irritation, brief hospital visits. But each time, operations resumed. The plant remained. So did the people. The neighborhood around the factory had grown. In the absence of zoning laws or regulation, new homes were built even closer to the facility walls. From the rooftop of some houses, you could see the tall cylindrical tanks that held the mic, surrounded by pipes and platforms. Some children played on the perimeter wall after school. Most people had stopped noticing the smell. On paper, the plant still listed safety measures. Mic was to be stored below a certain temperature, always under refrigeration. Tanks were monitored. There were flare towers, scrubbers, pressure relief valves. If anything went wrong, there were protocols. But off paper, things were different. Refrigeration units had been shut down to save on electricity. Leaks were managed with fabric strips. Pressure alarms were sometimes left ignored. Workers did their jobs as best they could with what they had. Most were not engineers. They were men with families, earning just enough to stay afloat. They didn't make the rules. They followed them, or tried to. And then there was the question of design. Many safety systems had been built to function one after another, in layers. If one failed, the next would take over. But what happened if none of them worked? What happened if the wrong mixture found its way into the wrong tank? What if water entered Mike? Some workers had asked. Management had said it couldn't happen. The system wouldn't allow it. But systems don't run themselves. They are run by people. And people get tired. They're rushed. They cut corners under pressure. And sometimes they don't know the danger they're standing next to. So when December arrived in Bhopal, most residents living near the plant were thinking about other things. The harvest had finished. The evenings were cool. Wedding season had begun. Families cooked in courtyards, stringing lights between door frames. In the factory, workers rotated through the night shifts. Alarms blinked on panels. Dials turned. Switches clicked. It was just another winter evening. No one was waiting for a disaster. But the signs were already there. In Tank 610, buried behind the factory walls, near the northern edge of the property, the mic level was high. The temperature was higher than it should have been. The gauges showed pressure beginning to build. No one sounded an alarm. Outside the factory gates, the neighborhoods were quiet. Dinner plates were being washed. Babies were being rocked to sleep. And a cloud was already forming, where no one could see it yet. It began just after midnight, though no one knew that at first. Inside the factory, 3 workers stood in the mic unit. It was a routine maintenance shift. One of them leaned over a panel of gauges, watching as the pressure reading ticked upward, slowly but steadily. A second worker glanced at the thermometer attached to Tank 610. It had risen again, hotter than it should be. Something was happening. They heard a hiss, soft at first, almost like a kettle beginning to boil. Then sharper, louder, with a vibration behind it, a low mechanical breath. One of them ran to a valve, tried to shut it. Another called for a supervisor. It wasn't panic yet. It was confusion, a familiar kind of factory confusion. When machines behave unpredictably, an instinct says you can probably fix it if you act fast enough. They didn't know that water had entered the tank hours earlier. No one had seen it happen. No one had watched the mixture build. But it was there, spreading through the liquid mic like a match dropped into oil. The chemical reaction had already started. The pressure kept rising. At approximately 12:30 a.m., the emergency venting system gave way. Tank 610 began to release its contents, not all at once, but steadily, then violently, as superheated mic turned to gas. A cloud burst upward and outward. It passed through the scrubber unit, which had been offline. It skipped the flare tower, which had been under maintenance. There was nothing to catch it, nothing to burn it off. There was only air, and then the neighborhoods. The clouds spread with the wind, south and southeast, toward Jai Prakash Nagar, toward Kazi Camp, toward the railway station, and into the tightly packed housing blocks. The gas hugged the ground. It didn't rise. It didn't drift harmlessly into the upper air. Mic was heavier than oxygen. It moved low through alleyways and cracks in doorways under beds into lungs. People woke up coughing. They didn't know why. Some thought it was a cooking fire nearby. Others thought it was smoke from trash burning. Then came the burning in the eyes, sharp, unbearable, followed by choking. Children woke up screaming, gasping. Some never woke up at all. Inside the factory, chaos unfolded. Alarms had been triggered, but they were faint. By the time the supervisors understood what had happened, the gas had already traveled beyond the perimeter wall. There were no protocols in place for this scale of failure. No containment. No neighborhood evacuation plan. Some workers tried to warn the town. One man ran to the street and shouted. Another called a local hospital. But the phones were slow. No one believed it could be real. Union Carbide had told the community, again and again, that the chemicals were safe, that there was nothing to fear. At 1 a.m., the streets were filling with people. Men and women stumbled out of their homes, carrying children who no longer breathed. Others ran blindly, their eyes swollen shut. The gas was invisible, but it carried a heavy smell, something like garlic and metal. A few people vomited as they ran. Others collapsed in the street. Their lungs seized, their throats blistered from the inside. Bhopal had no system to handle this. Hospitals were unprepared. Doctors didn't know what the gas was. There were no antidotes, no decontamination units. Ambulances were not equipped for a chemical emergency. Victims arrived barefoot, half-dressed, unconscious or delirious. Some were foaming at the mouth. Others bled from their noses or clenched their stomachs, unable to speak. At Hamidia Hospital, the halls were lined with bodies within hours. Nurses used cotton cloth to wipe tears from faces that had already stopped breathing. Volunteers dragged the dead outside to make space for the living. The morgue overflowed. Refrigeration failed. There was no time for autopsies. There were too many. The gas cloud continued to move. By 2 a.m., it had reached farther into the city. People who had slept with their windows open didn't wake up. Entire families lay still. Cattle and goats collapsed in yards. Birds dropped from trees. Stray dogs foamed and twitched in alleyways. No warning had been given. No sirens. No announcement from the plant. Only silence. And the smell. And death. By 3 a.m., the worst had passed. The gas had thinned, moved with the wind, and began to settle. But the damage had already been done. Bodies lay in the streets, along train tracks, in courtyards, in bed. Some were found clinging to each other, some alone. By 4 a.m., it was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence that follows something irreversible. It was the sound of a city that had not yet understood what it had just survived. In the hours between night and dawn, Bhopal stirred with the kind of movement that belongs to grief before it has found its name. The gas had spread its way through the northern districts in the dark, and now, as morning approached, the outlines of its destruction began to sharpen. Not in headlines, not yet in numbers, but in the way people moved. Slowly, unsteadily, one foot in front of the other, eyes red, throats raw, arms carrying the weight of children who would not open their eyes again. There had been no announcements, no sirens or coordinated response, no system to wake the city or guide it. People learned of the disaster not through information, but through sensation, a taste in the mouth, the collapse of a neighbor, the screams of someone who could no longer breathe. And so they ran, some barefoot, some without clothes, many not knowing where they were going, only that they needed to move away from whatever had filled their homes while they slept. At the city's public hospitals, the doors were already overwhelmed by 2 or 3 in the morning. Taxis, auto rickshaws, and bullock carts arrived without pause, bringing bodies slumped over laps or wrapped in bed sheets. In many cases, entire families came together. Fathers struggling to hold upright their unconscious wives, mothers weeping as they clutched children who had already gone cold, teenagers coughing blood into handkerchiefs while trying to keep their siblings awake. Most of them didn't speak. They simply moved forward in line, if a line could even be called that, as the lobby floors filled with moans and the stillness of those who no longer had breath to give. Doctors were not prepared. They had not been told what the gas was. There was no protocol to follow, no specific training for mass exposure to methyl isocyanate. No one handed them a chemical profile or dosage guide. They worked by instinct, by triage, by desperation. Oxygen tanks were wheeled from one ward to another. Eyewash solutions were prepared in basins, usually reserved for cleaning surgical tools. Nurses soaked cotton cloths and pressed them gently to faces burning from chemical contact. Medical interns performed CPR on the floor. It wasn't enough. By the time the sun began to rise, many hospitals had stopped trying to record names. Some no longer distinguished between the living and the dead as they were carried through the doors. There were simply too many. Sheets were pulled over bodies wherever space allowed, in stairwells, across benches, under trees outside. Strips of paper with numbers were taped to foreheads. Identification would come later. Maybe. Elsewhere in the city, those who had fled on foot during the night began to return home, slowly, uncertainly. They walked back not because they felt safe, but because they had nowhere else to go. They had left in panic, and now the morning light gave them the illusion that the danger had passed. But what they returned to was not home as they had known it. In some streets, dogs lay dead in piles. Goats slumped where they had been tied. Cows stood motionless, trembling and foaming at the mouth. Birds did not return to the trees. They had fallen from the branches hours earlier. And in the homes themselves, the scale of what had happened was just beginning to register. People found bodies on mats, in doorways, in the positions they had been sleeping. Children curled against walls. Infants held against chests that had stopped rising and falling sometime in the darkness. In more than a few cases, survivors sat beside their dead for hours, not knowing what else to do. They waited for help, for officials, for explanation, but none came. There were no emergency teams, no disaster response unit, no hazmat suits or doctors walking house to house. What came instead were rumors that the gas had come from Union Carbide, that the leak had already been stopped, that more gas could escape, that the factory was lying, that foreign engineers were on their way, that the entire city might need to be evacuated. Some said there was a second tank that might burst. Others said the wind would blow it back toward the neighborhoods again. The fear remained, reshaped now by uncertainty. By late morning, the railway station was filled with people trying to leave. Men clutched small bags and infants. Women balanced bundles on their heads. Ticket counters were swarmed. Trains pulled away with passengers hanging from doors. Bhopal was not only wounded, it was frightened. And the fear was growing faster than any coordinated response could contain. And still, Union Carbide said almost nothing. The factory's Indian managers gave no public statement that morning. Local government officials offered vague assurances. No one seemed able to say how much gas had leaked. No one explained what the chemical did to human lungs, to the eyes, to unborn children. No one said how long it would linger, or if more would come. Some reporters from local newspapers tried to document what they could. But the damage was not contained to one zone, and the lack of official information made everything harder. Some journalists counted bodies themselves. Others tried to reach the factory gates, and were turned away by guards. What little footage was captured showed not disaster zones, but quiet devastation. Entire blocks with no one standing, only families carrying one another towards somewhere else. By noon, the Indian government estimated the death toll at just over 1,000. Medical workers said it was far more. And residents knew it wasn't over, because the gas had not just killed, it had wounded. And those wounds were not all visible yet. The coughing had not stopped. The eye burns continued. Some people who had seemed well just hours earlier were beginning to fall ill. Children who had been carried to safety were now wheezing in their sleep. By afternoon, the scale of the disaster could no longer be denied. The cloud might have passed, but its presence remained, in lungs, in water, in skin. And all across the city, people kept asking the same question in different ways. What was in the air? And why weren't they told? By the afternoon of December 3rd, the gas had cleared from the air, but not from people's lungs, nor from the streets, nor from the bodies that lay in neat, silent rows beneath white sheets that fluttered slightly in the breeze. Bhopal had begun to breathe again, but nothing about the breath felt normal. The neighborhoods closest to the Union Carbide plant now carried an absence that couldn't be counted as easily as the dead. There were no school children in the lanes, no vegetable vendors, no temple bells echoing through courtyards. There were still people, but most of them were walking with lowered eyes, some holding handkerchiefs to their faces, others pressing damp cloths over their mouths even though the cloud was gone. The gas had left behind something less visible, a fear of air itself. Doctors continued treating patients with limited information. There were symptoms they hadn't expected. Blindness, foaming at the mouth, sudden violent miscarriages. Even those who had appeared stable in the morning were returning with complications by evening. Pregnant women were losing their children. Men who had run through the gas now could not stop vomiting. A few survivors had begun coughing up blood. There were no official answers. Hospitals were functioning without directives. Local clinics had no diagnostic tools for chemical exposure. Pharmacies had no protocol for this kind of poison. And still, no one in government had issued a clear statement. What little the public had heard came from panicked workers, scattered police, and the growing murmur among journalists that something at the Union Carbide plant had gone terribly, possibly criminally wrong. The factory remained mostly sealed, its gates closed. Security personnel turned away residents who came looking for answers. Survivors shouted questions from the street outside, holding up photographs of family members. Some pointed at the gas scrubber towers, asking what they were. Others asked whether another leak might still be possible. The men at the gate said nothing. Some didn't know. Some weren't authorized to speak. Some simply looked away. Union Carbide had not yet held a press conference. There was no acknowledgement of responsibility, no listing of chemicals involved, no public disclosure of what methyl isocyanate was or what it did. The only people who had answers were inside the gates, and they were not speaking. By early evening, makeshift morgues had been set up in schools and public halls. Local authorities had begun counting bodies more formally, but there was little agreement. Some lists included only those officially declared dead at hospitals. Others included anyone found in the streets. There was no central coordination, and with hundreds of unclaimed bodies, identification efforts quickly fell apart. Journalists began pushing harder. Photographers arrived from Delhi and Mumbai. International correspondents landed in Bhopal by nightfall, stepping into a story that already felt larger than what they could explain. Some went straight to the hospitals. Others walked into the slums, guided by residents who had not slept in nearly 24 hours. There were no PR handlers, no press kits, just the overwhelming clarity of what had happened. The scale of the disaster was not just in the number of dead, but in the faces of the survivors. Their expressions weren't loud or frantic. Most of them had already passed the point of shock. They simply stared into the cameras, eyes red and swollen, hands resting on the shoulders of people they no longer knew how to help. In the evening hours, the government of Madhya Pradesh finally issued a preliminary death count, just under 2,000. But doctors contradicted it immediately. Some said the real number was closer to 4,000 already, and growing. Others wouldn't estimate. What mattered more than the figure was that no one had seen a disaster of this kind before. Not on this scale, not from a chemical that was still not named on record. Only the local hospital staff had seen the effects firsthand. And what they described was staggering. Victims arrived with lungs filled with fluid. Some had burns on their faces and arms, but not from fire, from air itself. Children arrived with skin that peeled under the touch. Some had died before they reached the hospital gate. Others had been found in groups, families who had collapsed while trying to escape, dying within meters of safety. The symptoms were consistent: extreme respiratory distress, pulmonary edema, blindness, and chemical burns. But without knowing the precise chemical, there was no treatment plan. The medical response was still improvised. It was still guesswork. That same evening, just before midnight on December 3rd, Union Carbide finally released a brief statement to the press. They confirmed a leak had occurred. They described it as an accidental release of methyl isocyanate gas from the Bhopal plant. They expressed regret, and then they added that an investigation would follow. But they stopped short of admitting fault. The language was careful, the tone distant. No Union Carbide executive appeared in Bhopal that day. And for many in the city, that silence carried more weight than the gas itself. Because what had happened was no longer a secret. It was a question, and questions, when left unanswered, begin to multiply. How did water get into the tank? Why were the safety systems offline? Why was the gas scrubber not functioning? Why did no one alert the city? And perhaps most of all, why had a chemical this deadly been stored so close to where so many people lived? Some blamed the workers. Others blamed the equipment. But those who had been there, those who saw the pipes held together with cloth, those who smelled the chemical weeks before, those who had filed complaints and been ignored, they already knew. This was not a mistake in the way accidents are often described. It was a failure of decisions, a failure of care, a failure that had started long before the leak. And now, in the early hours after the worst night the city had ever known, Bhopal was no longer just a name. It was a place where death had arrived quietly, and where responsibility still hadn't. In the days following the gas leak, Bhopal entered a state of suspended reality. It was not recovery, not yet, but it was no longer emergency. The cloud had gone. The immediate panic had passed. What remained were numbers that shifted by the hour, bodies that had yet to be claimed, and a silence from those who should have been speaking. On the morning of December 4th, Union Carbide's chairman and CEO, Warren Anderson, boarded a company jet in the United States and flew to India. The visit, though framed as a gesture of responsibility, was carefully stage-managed. He was accompanied by other executives and legal advisors. The Indian government had requested his presence. They wanted answers, or perhaps to be seen as demanding them. But Anderson's visit to Bhopal lasted only a few hours. He was placed under house arrest shortly after landing, not far from the factory site, though never placed in a jail. The arrest was symbolic, largely procedural. He was released on bail the same day and flown back out of the country almost immediately, allowed to leave by officials who never fully explained the decision. It would be the last time he set foot on Indian soil. Back in Bhopal, there was no such swiftness. Relief efforts had only just begun. Army trucks arrived with supplies. Medical teams from other parts of India were deployed. Tents were set up to handle overflow from the hospitals. But most survivors still lay on concrete floors, some wrapped in blankets soaked with sweat and chemical residue. Water was scarce. Medicine was rudimentary. The dead were still being counted. By the end of the week, cremation grounds and burial sites were overwhelmed. At some ghats, funeral pyres burned 24 hours a day. In Muslim cemeteries, shallow graves stretched in rows that seemed to have no end. Gravediggers stopped counting. Many families, unable to afford ritual costs or identify their dead, left bodies to be buried by the state. There was no dignity in the process. No time. The Indian government issued a formal statement of mourning. It was declared a national tragedy. But for those still coughing, still blinded, still watching their children convulse in hospital beds, those words had little comfort. They wanted medicine. They wanted answers. They wanted justice. Instead, what they got was paperwork. Within days, registration camps were set up throughout the city. Survivors were instructed to sign up for compensation. Forms were handed out by police, stamped by municipal clerks. The process was slow, chaotic. Some people didn't understand what they were signing. Others had no documentation. Illiterate families were told to make thumbprints. It was the beginning of a bureaucratic storm that would last for decades. The government said it was preparing to sue Union Carbide. Lawsuits were drafted. Officials promised that the company would pay, and pay dearly. Numbers were floated, hundreds of millions in damages. Some officials called it the greatest industrial negligence the world had ever seen. They said foreign companies would be held to account, that corporations could not exploit India and leave. But at the Union Carbide plant, behind rusting gates and slowly fading signage, evidence was already disappearing. Indian authorities took control of the factory in name, but not in practice. Key documents vanished. Maintenance logs were never found. Blueprints were misplaced or sealed. And when investigators arrived weeks later, they found tanks already drained, safety systems dismantled, and equipment damaged by rust and exposure. Union Carbide's officials maintained that the cause of the leak was sabotage. They did not accept responsibility. In press releases, they suggested that a disgruntled employee might have deliberately introduced water into the tank. The company argued that the plant systems would not have failed on their own unless someone bypassed them. There was no evidence, but the claim was enough to muddy the waters. Suddenly, the conversation shifted from what had happened to who might have caused it, from systemic neglect to individual blame, from corporate accountability to mystery. Meanwhile, in Bhopal's neighborhoods, the suffering continued. People began to realize that the worst had not yet passed. Children who had survived the night of the gas leak were now developing fevers, skin lesions, and seizures. Women began miscarrying at unprecedented rates. Men collapsed at work, unable to breathe properly. Doctors were still unsure of the long-term effects of mic exposure, but early indications were horrifying. Lungs were scarred beyond repair. Eyes had gone permanently blind. Immune systems collapsed. Even those who had not been exposed directly, who had returned to the city a day later, reported symptoms. The chemical had entered the water supply. It lingered in soil, on clothing, in mattresses. It could not be washed away, and no one knew how far it had spread. People demanded testing. Environmental teams were slow to arrive. When they did, they focused their efforts on the factory itself, not the neighborhoods. Survivors stood in line for hours to have their blood drawn, only to be told the results would take weeks. Many never received them. Others received numbers without explanation. The meaning of abnormal hemoglobin or elevated enzyme markers meant little to those who simply wanted to know if they would survive. Local activists began organizing. They set up roadside clinics. They translated medical reports into Hindi. They met with lawyers and journalists and begged them not to forget what had happened. But even as they raised their voices, attention began to shift. Television coverage moved on to news stories. The disaster in Bhopal was no longer breaking news. It had become background. Only the survivors remained, and they understood, even then, that the real struggle had only just begun. By the time 1985 arrived, Bhopal had become both a city and a symbol. On maps, it remained a dot in central India. But in courtrooms, in newspapers, in government buildings on both sides of the world, it was shorthand for something larger, something that no one fully knew how to name. A tragedy, a case, a lesson, an embarrassment, a negotiation. For the people who had lived through it, the word was simpler. It was loss, of health, of family, of dignity, of trust. Union Carbide Corporation, headquartered in Danbury, Connecticut, had already begun to close ranks. Its executives expressed sympathy, but they made it clear that legal responsibility remained a matter of interpretation. They argued that the Bhopal plant was a locally managed operation, that the majority stake was held by Indian investors, that the safety decisions were made by the Indian subsidiary, not by its American parent. They said the gas leak was caused by sabotage, an intentional act by an unknown employee who had deliberately introduced water into the mic tank. The claim, offered without proof, served its purpose. It introduced doubt. In February 1985, the Indian government passed the Bhopal Gas Leak Disaster Processing of Claims Act. It gave itself the exclusive right to represent all victims in civil litigation. Survivors could no longer file lawsuits on their own. The state would speak for them. The reasoning was that it would streamline justice, create a single, powerful legal case instead of thousands of competing voices. But for many in Bhopal, it felt like their stories were being packaged and handed off to a system they didn't trust. Their injuries became claim numbers. Their families became evidence files. Their future would now depend on the negotiations of men who had never walked through their neighborhoods. The Indian government sued Union Carbide in a U.S. federal court, demanding $3 billion in damages. The company fought back. They challenged the jurisdiction, arguing that the case should be heard in India, not in the United States, that the Indian court system was capable, that the facts were local, that the law, if it were to be applied, should be Indian law. The U.S. court agreed. In 1986, the case was dismissed from the American legal system and referred back to India. It was seen as a victory for Union Carbide. In Bhopal, it felt like the ground shifted again, slowly but with a familiar finality. The case returned to the Indian courts. Years passed. Hearings were scheduled and postponed. Victims filled out forms and waited. Union Carbide began confidential negotiations with the Indian government. The media attention waned. Investigators moved on. International pressure softened. What had once been the center of global outrage was now becoming a legal process, long, slow, quietly suffocating. And then in 1989, an announcement. Without prior warning, without consultation with the survivors, the Indian Supreme Court declared a settlement had been reached. Union Carbide would pay $470 million. In exchange, all civil and criminal claims would be considered resolved. There would be no trial, no cross-examinations, no public accounting of what had gone wrong. The money was to be distributed to the victims. The The government would oversee it. The company admitted no liability. In the neighborhoods of Bhopal, the news arrived like a second wave. Many survivors had believed that justice, though slow, would come, that there would be a moment when the truth would be spoken aloud in court, when someone would be asked to explain why the safety systems had been turned off, why the tank had been overfilled, why there was no warning issued when the leak began, why the flare tower was down, why the refrigeration unit hadn't been repaired, why families had died in their sleep, never knowing what hit them. Instead, they were given a number, a dollar amount, agreed upon behind closed doors. The reaction was immediate. There were protests in Bhopal, marches through the streets, hunger strikes led by survivors and activists. They burned copies of the settlement order. They held up photos of the dead. They sat outside government buildings with signs that said, "We were not consulted. We were not finished. We are still sick." The Indian government defended the deal. It said the amount was fair, based on what could be proven. It said victims would be compensated quickly. But the bureaucracy was vast. Corruption was common. And what began as compensation turned into confusion. Years passed, and many people received nothing. Others received checks, so small they barely covered a month's medicine. Some names were missing from the rolls. Some documents were lost. And always, the bodies kept aging faster than they should. Children born after the gas leak were growing up with twisted limbs, compromised lungs, weakened immune systems. Doctors diagnosed neurological conditions, vision problems, bone malformations. Environmental studies began to show contamination in the soil and water near the factory site. The gas had vanished, but its echo remained, in wells, in wombs, in bloodlines. And through all of it, the factory sat sealed, locked by court order. No one dismantled the plant. No one cleaned the chemicals that remained inside. No one secured the waste. In the monsoons, the water flowed through the rusted buildings, picked up traces of poison, and carried it out into the streets again. Union Carbide had left, and Bhopal stayed. It had always been just a factory. That's how it was seen by the people who lived around it. Just a cluster of buildings behind a wall, some machinery, a gate where men in blue uniforms stood. Children walked past it on their way to school. Couples sat on the grass just beyond its fence during winter evenings. For most of Bhopal, Union Carbide was a background presence, unremarkable, unmoving, understood vaguely to be connected to agriculture. A place where something useful was made. But those who worked inside knew that it was more than a place for fertilizer and pesticide. It was a system of risks controlled through timing, training, and maintenance. One that required constant vigilance. One that had been slipping for years. By the time the gas was released from Tank 610 on the night of December 2nd, 1984, the plant's decline was no longer theoretical. It had become visible. It had a shape. The warning signs were real. The safety systems were broken. And the people who could have prevented it no longer had the power to act, or had stopped trying altogether. The design of the Bhopal plant had originally been based on a model used in Union Carbide's U.S. operations. But the version built in India was not identical. In theory, both handled methyl isocyanate, mic, with extreme caution. But in practice, the Indian plant's safety systems were degraded from the start. Mic is a liquid at room temperature, but it turns into gas easily, especially under pressure or heat. It's reactive with water, even in small amounts. The reaction is exothermic. It releases heat, pressure, and toxic vapor. If you store it, you must do so at low temperatures. You must keep it sealed. You must have backup systems. And if anything begins to go wrong, you must respond within minutes. In Bhopal, those protections had been systematically removed. The refrigeration unit, meant to keep mic below 5 degrees Celsius, had been shut off weeks earlier to cut costs. The tank that would eventually rupture, Tank 610, had been left with over 40 tons of mic in it. That was far more than it was designed to hold. Maintenance reports had shown corrosion in valves and piping. The flare tower, which could have burned off leaking gas, had been out of service for months. The vent gas scrubber, a second line of defense, had also been turned off. There had been drills in the past, but by late 1984, those had stopped. When workers raised concerns, they were ignored or reassigned. On the evening of December 2nd, a small crew was on duty. Most of them were technicians, not engineers. They had basic training. They understood the layout of the pipes and tanks. But few of them knew exactly how dangerous mic was in its raw form. Some had heard it could blind or kill. Others thought it was simply irritating. Around 9:30 p.m., water was introduced into the system, either through a valve left open or during routine cleaning. There's no conclusive record of how or why it happened. The design of the system should have prevented water from entering the mic tank. There were isolation valves. There were supposed to be checks. But in Bhopal, many of the valves had been leaking for months. Some had been patched with rubber strips. Others had been left partially open to release pressure manually. The water moved through the pipes unnoticed. No alarms were triggered. The reaction began quietly. Molecules meeting in darkness, heat building inside the tank wall by millimeters. By 10:30 p.m., the temperature inside tank 610 had begun to rise. The pressure gauge showed a slow climb. A technician noted it in the logbook. No action was taken. The supervisor was told. He dismissed it. The gauges often fluctuated. No one suspected a leak. The tank had acted this way before. But this time was different. The chemical reaction between mic and water does not slow down on its own. It accelerates. More heat leads to more pressure. The gas inside expands rapidly. Shortly after midnight, workers heard a deep rumble. Some said it sounded like boiling water. Others described it as a muffled roar. One technician walked to the vent line and saw white vapor pouring from the tower. He yelled for help. Others ran to check the valves. It was too late. The emergency venting system burst open, releasing the pressure from tank 610 into the night air. The flare tower was offline. The scrubber was off. There was nothing between the gas and the city. At least 30 tons of mic escaped into the atmosphere. It moved south, pushed by a gentle winter breeze, dense and colorless, hugging the ground as it passed through narrow lanes and sleeping neighborhoods. This is what is now known. It is not speculation. It is not mystery. It is failure, documented and confirmed through investigations by Indian agencies, independent experts, and Union Carbide's own internal records, some of which were leaked years later by whistleblowers. In the aftermath, the company insisted that sabotage was the only explanation, that someone had deliberately introduced water into the tank. But multiple independent investigations, including those led by Indian scientists and the Central Bureau of Investigation, found no evidence of foul play. What they found was a chain of negligence. A tank overfilled, a valve left open, a safety culture that no longer existed, a management team that prioritized cost-cutting over lives, a factory with a known toxic inventory placed beside some of the poorest and most vulnerable neighborhoods in the city, a choice made without fences, without emergency planning, without community warning systems. There had been small leaks before. They had been reported. There had been a fatal exposure in 1981. That too had been reported. And each time, the company had responded with explanations and promises. They said new equipment would be installed, that the systems were safe, that no further incident would occur. But the night of December 2nd proved that everything had been a matter of luck. Until it wasn't. The decisions that led to that night were made in meeting rooms and budget reviews. They were signed off in offices far from Bhopal. The savings were small, a few $1,000s in electricity, a delay in parts orders, a downsizing of staff. But the cost, when it came, was paid by people who had no part in those decisions, by the children who died in their beds, by the women who miscarried in the streets, by the men who returned to their homes after the gas had passed, only to find that everything had changed. It is often said that disasters reveal what was already broken. In Bhopal, that brokenness was structural, political, legal, chemical, and it had a name printed on signs at the factory gate. But by the time anyone admitted it, it had already become a graveyard. The factory was eventually sealed. The chemicals inside were left untouched. The buildings were left to rot. The towers still stand today, rusted and silent, their shadows stretching over a city that has learned to live alongside them. And all these years later, the night of December 2nd remains one of the clearest case studies in avoidable catastrophe. Not because of one moment of failure, but because of every moment that came before it. Time did not move forward in Bhopal the way it did elsewhere. In the city that had once been defined by its lakes and its slow afternoons, the calendar stopped holding the same meaning after December 1984. The months that followed the gas leak were measured not in seasons or celebrations, but in symptoms. It was no longer a matter of how long it had been since the disaster. It was how long someone had been coughing, how long their child had struggled to eat, how long they had waited for compensation that never arrived. The cloud had gone, yes, but its shadow did not lift. For those who had survived that night, recovery was never truly offered. There was no coordinated public health response, no long-term government medical plan, no psychological counseling, no real environmental cleanup. Instead, there were forms, verification offices, delayed checks, rejected claims. The survivors stood in lines that seemed to have no end, outside government buildings, outside hospitals, outside the gates of the very factory that had poisoned them. Many of them were women who had lost their husbands, children who had lost their parents, men who had once been strong enough to work 12-hour shifts, now left wheezing after climbing a flight of stairs. In the homes closest to the plant, sickness became routine. It was in the skin, rashes that never fully healed. In the blood, infections that didn't respond to antibiotics. In the lungs, a permanent shortness of breath, like trying to breathe through wet cloth. In the eyes, damage that blurred the world into fog. And in the silence, the weight of knowing that no one outside was really watching anymore. The city had become, over time, a kind of open wound. But it was a wound that the rest of the world could ignore. Once the headlines had faded and the cameras were gone, the survivors were left with nothing but a name, Bhopal, and the understanding that their pain had become symbolic before it had ever been healed. Many survivors turned to one another. Women formed groups, held meetings on plastic chairs in dusty courtyards. They passed around tattered medical records, handwritten prescriptions, lab reports that meant little outside the city's crumbling clinics. They memorized the names of chemicals that no one had taught them to pronounce. Men held protests. Some sewed banners. Some stopped eating until the government responded. Others filed new petitions, wrote to politicians, held signs outside courtrooms, hoping to remind the nation that they were still alive. And still waiting. The factory itself remained frozen in time. The Union Carbide site was never fully cleaned. The chemicals left behind, hundreds of tons of toxic waste, remained in rusting barrels and open pits. During monsoon seasons, the water turned yellow in the drains. The air inside the fence line still smelled faintly of corrosion and rot. Children who lived nearby played outside the walls, too young to remember what had once happened, too poor to move elsewhere. Even in death, the story continued. Families who buried their loved ones in the days after the leak were told that no autopsies would be conducted. The dead were too many, the facilities too limited. In some cases, government workers handled cremations without names, stacking the bodies in 3s or 4s, burning them as quickly as possible. Their ashes were swept aside. Their names, in many cases, never added to any official list. It would take decades before researchers began to understand the full extent of the disaster's generational impact. By the early 2000s, studies showed that the chemicals had reached into the city's groundwater. That birth defects in the surrounding neighborhoods were sharply higher than the national average. That children were being born with shortened limbs, cleft palates, brain damage, compromised immune systems. Doctors described the symptoms as chronic, compounding, and largely untreatable. Parents described them more simply. Their children were suffering, and there was no help. The hospitals built after the disaster were never enough. One, the Bhopal Memorial Hospital and Research Center, was established with money from the legal settlement. But within years, it had been plagued by funding shortages, outdated equipment, and a lack of specialists. Survivors were turned away. The very people it had been built to serve were made to feel unwelcome. their presence a burden rather than a right. Outside, the survivors gathered again. They formed the Bhopal Gas Pidit Mahila Udyog Sangathan, the Organization of Women Gas Victims. They formed the Bhopal Group for Information and Action. They built websites, gave interviews, shared scans of documents that governments had refused to release. They organized protests not just in Bhopal, but in Delhi, in London, in Washington, in front of the United Nations. They carried photos of their children. They held bottles of contaminated water. They stood in front of shareholders at Union Carbide's parent company, now Dow Chemical, and asked the same question again and again. Who will clean up what was left behind? But the silence returned. Just like after the night of the leak, the answers never came quickly. Or at all. No Union Carbide executive ever faced trial in person. Warren Anderson, the former CEO, lived the rest of his life in the United States. He died in 2014 in a quiet New York suburb, never having returned to India. Dow Chemical, which bought Union Carbide in 2001, denied legal responsibility for the Bhopal plant. They called the settlement of 1989 final. They argued that the site was now the responsibility of the Indian government. The Indian government, in turn, argued that Dow should be held accountable. And so it went. Responsibility passed like a sealed envelope that no one wanted to open. But inside Bhopal, the truth was visible. It was in the shallow breath of an old man still waiting on a pension check. It was in the soft-spoken girl whose legs would never straighten. It was in the hands of mothers who held onto fading photographs, asking the same question after every delay, every court date, every denial. How long must we wait to be believed? In the years that followed the gas leak, what remained in Bhopal was not only physical illness, but the growing awareness that justice would not come through the systems people had once trusted. Investigations had begun quickly after the disaster. Technical panels were assembled. Parliamentary committees met behind closed doors. Experts analyzed the causes and failures at the Union Carbide plant. But the question that continued to rise above all others, who would be held responsible, never received a clear or lasting answer. Warren Anderson, the chairman and CEO of Union Carbide Corporation at the time of the leak, had flown to India within a week of the disaster. His visit was brief. He met with officials, spent a few hours in Bhopal, and was placed under a form of protective custody. He was released on bail the same day and allowed to leave the country. Indian officials later claimed he had given his word that he would return if summoned by the courts. He never did. In 1987, 3 years after the leak, Indian prosecutors charged Anderson and several other company executives with culpable homicide. Arrest warrants were issued, and Anderson was declared a fugitive by Indian courts. The Indian government formally requested his extradition from the United States. That request remained unanswered for years. U.S. authorities cited legal technicalities and insufficient evidence under the terms of the extradition treaty. As a result, Anderson remained in the United States for the rest of his life, living without legal consequence for the role he played in one of the world's deadliest industrial disasters. At the same time, cases moved slowly against the Indian managers of Union Carbide India Limited. Some were summoned to court repeatedly over a span of 2 decades. Procedural delays, appeals, and jurisdictional disputes kept the case in legal limbo. By the time a verdict was reached in 2010, more than 25 years had passed since the leak. The court sentenced 8 former employees of the Indian subsidiary, all middle-level managers, to 2 years in prison for criminal negligence. They were granted bail within hours of the verdict. There was no trial for the senior officials at Union Carbide Corporation. No legal hearing in which the global parent company was cross-examined or forced to respond to the safety failures that had contributed to the disaster. The Indian government had agreed, in the 1989 civil settlement, to drop all criminal and civil liability claims against the company in exchange for a lump sum payment. That settlement, finalized without input from survivors, effectively shielded Union Carbide and its executives from further legal exposure. Activists in Bhopal and their legal advocates continued to fight for renewed charges and higher compensation. In 2010, the Indian government filed a curative petition before the Supreme Court, asking that the original settlement be revisited and increased. They argued that the original estimates of death and injury used to calculate damages were grossly underestimated, and that the amount paid by Union Carbide was insufficient given the scope of human suffering and environmental damage. The case remained pending for years. The court never ruled decisively on the petition. By this time, Union Carbide had become a subsidiary of Dow Chemical Company, following a merger in 2001. Dow maintained that it bore no responsibility for the actions of its acquired company in India. It did not appear in court. It did not respond to summons. It did not engage with Indian authorities. Instead, it claimed that the settlement of 1989 had resolved all liabilities permanently. The site of the disaster, the old Union Carbide plant, remained under the control of Indian state agencies. Toxic waste stored at the site was never properly disposed of. Rainwater continued to seep through the chemical remnants stored in open containers and underground tanks. Local groundwater tests confirmed contamination in the surrounding neighborhoods. Dozens of requests were made to initiate cleanup. No formal remediation was carried out. The legal process had become a symbol not of justice, but of delay. A generation of survivors had grown up attending hearings, filing affidavits, submitting medical records, and waiting for decisions that never arrived. Many of them died before their cases were resolved. Some were declared ineligible for compensation due to missing paperwork. Others received small settlements that failed to cover even the cost of basic medication. International pressure had long since disappeared. The United Nations issued no sanctions. No international court was convened. Despite the scale of the disaster, Bhopal remained a domestic legal matter, unresolved, largely unacknowledged outside India, and dismissed by the corporate entities involved. The survivors continued to organize. They staged protests. They traveled to Delhi, to Geneva, to the United States. They brought water samples to shareholders' meetings. They marched outside chemical trade conferences. But none of these efforts led to a criminal conviction for those who had designed, approved, or neglected the systems that failed on that night. The legal trail narrowed over time. Documents were archived. Officials retired. Some of the accused died before they could be questioned. The extradition request for Warren Anderson was never renewed. He passed away in 2014 without ever being required to testify. What remained, more than 3 decades after the disaster, was a long record of missed opportunities, chances for accountability that were repeatedly passed over in favor of settlement, denial, or political expedience. In Bhopal, the law had not brought closure. It had not prevented suffering. It had not removed the waste or compensated the families who were still grieving. It had merely passed through the city year by year, leaving behind a trail of signatures, verdicts, and promises that never changed the air, the water, or the condition of those who survived. In the years after the disaster, the daily lives of those who remained in Bhopal became a quiet record of long-term survival. There was no formal declaration of recovery, no moment when the city could claim that the damage had been addressed, or that the consequences of the gas leak had passed. What had happened was too large, too complex, and too poorly handled to leave room for closure. For many families living near the old Union Carbide plant, each day was structured around health, paperwork, and adaptation. Access to care remained limited, and for those with chronic conditions, especially lung disorders, joint problems, and eye injuries, the available treatment often consisted of short prescriptions and long waits. Clinics established for gas victims struggled with staffing and medicine shortages, and even when treatment was available, the long-term prognosis was unclear. Children born in the years after the disaster often faced additional challenges. Studies conducted by independent researchers as well as public health agencies recorded a higher prevalence of congenital conditions, learning disabilities, and developmental delays in the surrounding neighborhoods. Many families were never given a clear explanation. Medical professionals referred to environmental factors, genetic risk, or malnutrition, But for the parents who had survived the gas leak and now watched their children struggle, there was little doubt about the connection. Education was difficult for some children growing up in gas-affected areas. Illness, fatigue, and frequent medical appointments often meant absences from school. Others faced social stigma. The label of gas victim, which appeared on ration cards and official forms, made some students targets of exclusion or pity. In public spaces, that label came with assumptions that the family was poor, that they were unwell, that they carried problems others didn't want nearby. For many, the economic impact of the disaster was permanent. Families that had once relied on factory work, day labor, or small trading operations now had to navigate disability, irregular income, and limited job opportunities. Women, especially widows and single mothers, often carried the weight of supporting households while managing caregiving responsibilities. Some joined advocacy networks or worked with non-governmental organizations, taking on roles that offered modest stipends and some measure of purpose. Others did what they could informally, cooking, sewing, cleaning, to contribute. Life around the factory site changed in appearance, but not in substance. The plant remained closed, its structures corroding over time. Fences rusted, paint peeled, tanks stood unused, but the chemicals left behind were never removed. Environmental studies showed contamination of groundwater and soil in the nearby communities, including known carcinogens and heavy metals. Rainwater flowed through the plant grounds and into surrounding neighborhoods, especially during monsoon season. Residents continued to use water from local pumps despite warnings, because alternatives were inconsistent or unavailable. The environmental cleanup that had been promised was never implemented in full. Government agencies cited funding limitations, disputes over jurisdiction, and ongoing litigation. Dow Chemical, which had acquired Union Carbide, denied responsibility for the site. Legal battles continued, but they did little to change the condition of the land or the health of the people who lived on it. Some parts of Bhopal grew in the years that followed. The city developed modern infrastructure in its newer districts, and government offices were built that served the wider state. But none of that growth reached the blocks adjacent to the factory. These areas remained visibly different, poorer, more densely packed, and more heavily burdened by illness and institutional neglect. For those living there, the disaster was not something that had happened long ago. It remained part of their everyday reality. Over time, survivors became the caretakers of the story. Some gave interviews to researchers and journalists. Others spoke at public forums or participated in legal workshops. But most did not seek attention. They were concerned with housing, income, treatment, and the next appointment at a government clinic. Public memory faded. Media attention turned elsewhere. Lawsuits dragged on. For the survivors, waiting became a kind of constant. They waited for clean water. They waited for compensation checks that were reduced or denied. They waited for officials to acknowledge that the gas had done more than kill, that it had altered the course of life for hundreds of thousands of people in ways no settlement could ever resolve. There was no moment of justice and no definitive point at which the impact of the disaster ended. Instead, what existed was continuity of illness, of environmental risk, of unanswered questions, and of survival. As time passed, the Bhopal gas disaster became a subject studied more than a crisis addressed. Universities added it to casebooks on industrial regulation. Law schools examined it as a model of liability without accountability. Environmental science programs used it to illustrate the dangers of toxic manufacturing. It appeared in corporate ethics modules, in international policy debates, and in government reports filed far from the place where the disaster occurred. In these spaces, Bhopal was treated as a turning point, a moment that revealed the limits of safety protocols, the failure of multinational oversight, and the risks of industrial outsourcing in developing countries. It was often cited alongside other major events: Chernobyl, Fukushima, Deepwater Horizon. But the way Bhopal was referenced differed from those others. It had no final investigation that clarified every fact. There was no trial with witness testimony that established a definitive version of events. The factory site remained largely untouched, and the people most affected by the disaster were not part of the conversations in which it was discussed. Governments made public statements on anniversaries. There were declarations of sympathy. A few commissions were formed, but these gestures rarely came with funding or direct action. Most decisions about Bhopal's future were made without those living in its shadow. Laws were amended, but enforcement remained weak. Corporations added new guidelines, but those guidelines were not retroactive. In some circles, Bhopal became shorthand for mismanagement or for the failure of corporate accountability. But for survivors, those terms did not capture the actual experience of living through and beyond the disaster. Many international companies reviewed their policies after Bhopal. Safety inspections were updated. Risk mitigation plans became standard. Insurance models shifted. But these changes were primarily intended to protect future investments, not to address the needs of the people who were still attending weekly medical clinics in Bhopal's affected neighborhoods. The Indian government maintained several programs for survivors, but these were often underfunded or inconsistently delivered. Some schemes promised free medicine. Others offered disability payments or housing assistance. The eligibility requirements were complex, and record-keeping was inconsistent. Many survivors found themselves excluded from benefits due to lost documents or administrative errors. Appeals were possible, but they were slow and frequently unsuccessful. Environmental remediation efforts at the Union Carbide site were debated for decades. Technical panels were formed to study the waste left behind. Some experts called for full excavation and removal of the contaminated soil. Others recommended sealing the site and constructing barriers. But no consensus was reached, and no major cleanup was carried out. In the meantime, residents continued to report chemical odors during the rainy season. Livestock deaths, skin rashes, and stomach illness were common in nearby communities. International pressure diminished over time. Global attention moved on. Humanitarian groups relocated staff. Journalists who had once written deeply reported features now covered the disaster only on anniversaries. Even when foreign media returned to Bhopal, they often focused on symbolism. Candles at memorials, photographs of empty cribs, painted walls with the date of the disaster, rather than the ongoing institutional failure to provide restitution or health care. The courts in India continued to process appeals. Survivors' organizations filed petitions to reopen cases, challenge settlement amounts, or force a corporate appearance in court. These filings generated headlines from time to time, but few resulted in concrete changes. The legal system had absorbed the case into its backlog, and decisions came slowly. Each delay reduced the likelihood that key figures would ever be held accountable. Some of the original Union Carbide managers died. Others moved on. Younger judges were assigned to inherited case files. The survivors aged, and many died before rulings were made. Dow Chemical, which acquired Union Carbide in 2001, refused to appear before Indian courts. It maintained that the matter had been settled before the merger. Legal teams for Dow filed motions challenging jurisdiction and relevance. As of the early 2020s, Dow continued to do business in India, receiving contracts, selling products, and operating subsidiaries. Activists protested this regularly, but the company's position did not change. For many survivors, the idea of justice had shifted. It no longer meant criminal punishment for those involved. It no longer meant financial compensation, at least not in a form that would make up for the losses. Instead, justice became a question of memory and recognition, of making sure the world understood what had happened, not as a distant tragedy, but as a preventable event with real people, real decisions, and real consequences. Commemorations were held annually in Bhopal. On December 3rd, survivors and their families gathered to read names, share stories, and walk the perimeter of the old plant. Some lit candles. Others held signs listing demands that had not changed in decades. Clean water, full cleanup, better health care, corporate accountability. They didn't do this because they expected immediate results. They did it because they believed the story needed to stay visible, and because they had lived long enough to see how easily silence replaces action. The gas leak that occurred in Bhopal in 1984 is often described as the world's worst industrial disaster. But for those still living in its aftermath, that phrase has never felt accurate. It is not just a ranking of casualties. It is not just a case study or a mistake that can be learned from and moved past. It was a turning point in their lives, one that arrived without warning and for which there has never been a meaningful resolution. The disaster in Bhopal did not end with the gas leak, and it did not end with the compensation settlement or the court decisions or the death of the company's executives. It became a part of the city's structure, not in a metaphorical sense, but in the literal, physical spaces where the consequences remained present. It shaped how people moved, what they drank, where they worked, and what they expected from the future. The abandoned factory still stands. Its walls are cracked, its towers rusted, and its chemical drums partially buried in open ground. Children walk past it on their way to school. Workers cut through its edges to reach other parts of town. Trees grow in the corners of its former storage yards, but no meaningful containment or cleanup has been completed. Government agencies continue to disagree about who is responsible for remediation. Legal efforts to force corporate action have stalled in courtrooms, both domestic and foreign. Inside the city, health problems linked to the gas and its aftermath remain common. Clinics still record respiratory conditions, immune disorders, and unexplained neurological symptoms among residents. The children of survivors often live with developmental issues, some of which were not understood or studied for decades. Doctors in Bhopal work without access to advanced diagnostic tools. Patients are often treated without confirmation of cause, and many of the same people return again and again, seeking treatment that will not make them well, but may give them a few more days of comfort. Water remains a persistent concern. Even in areas where piped municipal water has been installed, residents still rely on hand pumps or wells during outages. In many of the poorest neighborhoods, no alternative is available. Families continue to use water that has tested positive for toxic substances because it is the only option. Warnings are posted, but they carry little weight when no solution is offered alongside them. Activists continue their work. Some have been involved since the 1980s. Others are the children or grandchildren of survivors. They organize community health checks, legal awareness campaigns, and commemorative events. Some travel abroad to speak at conferences. Others remain local, maintaining small offices, translating legal documents, and advising families on how to register claims or appeal rejected forms. Their work is constant and often unpaid. They operate in the absence of reliable institutional support. Few major changes have been made to India's industrial safety laws as a result of Bhopal. The factory disaster remains the clearest example of corporate negligence in the country's history, yet regulations around chemical storage, emergency response, and industrial zoning have not been uniformly strengthened across the country. Safety drills are still rare. Public warning systems in areas near hazardous facilities are inconsistent. The mechanisms to prevent another Bhopal exist on paper, but enforcement is often absent. Internationally, the story of Bhopal has become a point of reference. It is cited in training modules for industrial managers. It appears in discussions of corporate responsibility, environmental ethics, and the legal limits of globalization. But the people of Bhopal, especially those who still live near the factory, rarely see their experiences reflected in these discussions. Their lives are not framed by theory or policy. They are shaped by the practical reality of being left with the consequences. Survivors have not forgotten what happened. They live with it every day. But they do not only remember the gas or the night of the leak. They remember the days after, when no one arrived, when the explanations were vague, when the compensation was confusing, when the water changed color and the breathing never returned to normal. They remember having to prove they had been affected. They remember standing in line, watching officials flip through folders to see if their names had been recorded properly. They remember being told to wait, again and again, for something to change. For many, The hardest part has not been the injury itself, but the absence of recognition. Not symbolic recognition, not statues or declarations, but practical, consistent acknowledgement in the form of health care, clean water, safe housing, and access to justice. What they have received instead is a series of delays, dismissals, and unkept promises. The story of Bhopal is not one of a single failure. It is the accumulation of many decisions made by many people over many years that placed cost ahead of safety, speed ahead of care, and reputation ahead of responsibility. The disaster is no longer a headline. It is no longer a case that international institutions actively pursue. It does not appear in daily news cycles or top-level government briefings. But it continues quietly in the lives of people who breathe the same air, drink from the same pipes, and carry the same symptoms that began 4 decades ago. Those who survived have aged. Some are now in their 60s and 70s. Others did not reach that age. The next generation has inherited not only the medical conditions, but the burden of keeping the story alive. They do so not because it brings resolution, but because it offers a record, a documentation of what happens when harm is allowed to persist, when no one is held accountable, and when justice becomes an idea instead of an action. There is no conclusion to this story, not because it is too complex, but because it has never been resolved. The factory still stands. The waste is still there. The people are still waiting. And the air, even when clear, still carries the memory of what was once allowed to pass through it. Not by nature, not by accident, but by choice.